This doesn't look much like victory, but in this long war of attrition, you take what you get, even if it's a damaged Russian tank. Here in Kharkiv, a Ukrainian counteroffensive has managed to push the enemy out and back towards Russia's own border.
Коли тікали, місцеві говорять, що сняли і втекли. Остався таки один, він висить на вишці.
But retreat in one pocket of eastern Ukraine is not mirrored elsewhere. The Russians have still taken significant parts of the Donbass region, a silver lining after the dark clouds of their initial offensive. And as the invasion drags on, President Zelensky continues his virtual tour of world allies. Not a victory lap, but a chance to question Western failures.
Роками в Європі боялися вступу України в альянс, в НАТО. Бо якщо почалась війна з Росією, так говорили, то довелося б усім воювати проти неї. Проти неї, я б сказав, за Україну. Але хіба не в цьому сенс НАТО? Таке питання. Хіба не в тому, що всі за одного?
For how much would Zelensky like to be in the same boat as Sweden? Boris Johnson today headed to Stockholm and then Helsinki, amid the expectation that both usually neutral Nordic nations will apply to join NATO within days.
President Putin thought he could cause division, but he has achieved the opposite. We stand here today, more united than ever, and with the ambition of strengthening our bonds even more.
The UK today signed security declarations with both countries to enhance their defence before membership is finalised. Since its inception in 1949, NATO has expanded beyond its original 12 countries. It now has 30 members, with several nations from the former Soviet Union joining as the alliance expanded east. That allowed NATO troops to position themselves along the eastern flank following Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014. And since the invasion of Ukraine, those numbers have been reinforced, angering President Putin.
Таким образом, планомерно создавалась абсолютно неприемлемая для нас угроза, причем непосредственно у наших границ.
The Kremlin has warned of military and political repercussions if Finland and Sweden join NATO, as this would more than double the alliance's 754-mile land border with Russia to nearly 1,600 miles. Those countries have historically been neutral, but the Ukraine war has changed the landscape. While Putin hoped this military might would scare off nations joining NATO, instead it's set to expand, and Finland, once fearful of prodding the Russian bear, is ready to pick sides.
Finland has, of course, traditionally been neutral, but this is formalising and making clear something that needs to be made explicit in the context of today, and that is that in the event of an attack on either of us, we will come to each other's support.
Finland and Sweden's troops have been taking part in NATO exercises this year. Russia will see their probable NATO accession as provocation. But for these two nations, this is about defence against the clearest of provocateurs, Vladimir Putin.
Well, earlier I spoke to Fabrice Potier, who's a former director of policy planning at NATO, and asked him what he made of the new security guarantees which Britain is making with Sweden and Finland.
Well, I think the train had already left the station a while ago, and it was almost a given that both countries were going to join the alliance. I think it was now more a question of technicality, and therefore the visit of Prime Minister Johnson is important because the UK alongside the US is, I understand, going to be one of those countries providing bilateral security guarantees to both Finland and Sweden in the interim, because basically they are going to announce their membership bid, but until they are full-fledged members, you have a gap, and that gap needs to be filled with some security guarantees that if anything were to happen, some big NATO countries like the US, but also the UK will have their back.
Isn't it all a bit hollow when Ukraine asked for that security guarantee and it was refused? It's all very well giving it to Sweden and Finland. They're not being attacked.
Well, that's, I think, a fair question. And I think that's a question that should be asked to both the 30 heads of states of NATO, but also to the Ukraine leadership. I think that one fundamental difference, obviously, is that both Sweden and Finland are also members of the European Union. They have been extremely close partners to NATO since actually Putin's first war of aggression against Ukraine in 2014, 2015.
The bigger NATO gets and the more countries it has to give security guarantees to, I suppose there is a danger that Putin might say, this is big talk. You know, how can NATO demonstrate that it's serious?
Well, that's an important question, because this is the essence of what NATO is about and what deterrence is about. And I think it demonstrates that first by having countries like actually Finland. Look at the Finnish land forces. They're actually one of the most capable and biggest land forces among the NATO countries. They're going to feel actually one of our weak points across the alliance. So if you look at those NATO members who have real capabilities, real well-trained forces, intelligence capabilities, that's already a signal to Vladimir Putin that we are capable of pushing back and defending ourselves.
Except we haven't, because we're still funding him.
Absolutely. And this is another of our contradictions, is we are sending $1 billion a day to Vladimir Putin's war machine. And this is why I think having an EU agreement on an oil and gas embargo is absolutely key to basically ending this war. So we are sitting practically on the nuclear button and unwilling to trigger it, especially countries like Germany. And I think until we do that, Putin will have some room for maneuver economically to continue prosecuting his war.
Is there a danger that it also plays into Putin's propaganda? We know from what he said on May the 9th that his narrative is that Russia was about to be attacked. Now, if you suddenly have Finland with all its armed forces, as you say, joining NATO, will he not turn around and say, look, what NATO is planning?
I think Vladimir Putin is kind of prisoner of his own Freudian loop, where he's trying to prevent what actually his actions are creating. So I think, you know, he has been claiming that what he's doing in Ukraine is also to prevent and in reaction to NATO expansion. And actually, because of what he's done in Ukraine, indeed, NATO is expanding and will probably have 2 new members by the time when they meet in Madrid.
Mr. Potier, thank you very much.
Pleasure.